Thank you. I'll be talking about politics and power in the low carbon electricity transition. And I'll be looking at green niches and fighting against existing regimes. I will use a multi-level perspective, which I developed previously, to further the paper is mainly empirical and has some conclusions about politics and power. So it makes an assessment of progress and setbacks in this electricity transition. So I look at what are the drivers of green niches, how are they evolving, but also what's the stability, or maybe better the resilience of existing regimes, mainly in the generation sides of coal, gas and nuclear. So that will lead to an empirical assessment of where we are. And then I have some conclusions about politics and power, which help to enrich this multi-level perspective. And also be a bit more concrete, because I've read stuff about post-political discourse and some of the political science remains rather abstract about politics and power. So I wanted to make it a bit more concrete as well. I loosely built on this Three Phases of Power from Lux in 1974. This is the multi-level perspective. There are green niches, radical innovations emerging, fighting against an existing regime in a wider landscape. And dynamically it looks like this: green niches emerging, a lot of uncertainty, variety, trial and error, stable regimes. And transitions only happen into sort of an external shock which opens up the regime, creating a window of opportunity. And if at the same time these niches gain momentum, then we can get a breakthrough. And just to summarize what I think is happening with the electricity transition is that actually we see quite a lot of momentum in green alternatives, wind and solar in particular. So that's good. But we don't see, that would be my, we don't see this opening up of the regime falling apart. So part of my story will be, yes, we see this, there's momentum, although I think the momentum is weakening, but basically we still see a lot of stability or resilience in the coal, gas and nuclear regimes. So that's why my overall assessment will be that we are on a very slow transition pathway. There's a bit of a tension in the paper that the first section is about Europe and the second is about the UK, but this is about renewable electricity, just few slides, which is that actually there's a positive story to tell in the last 20 years. This is from Europe, that actually the amount of renewable electricity has grown from 1990, when it was about 12.2%, to almost 20% in 2010, so that's quite good. But you do need to distinguish between the old renewables, which is hydro, biomass and wood, which has been made more or less stable. We've got lots of hydro, particularly in Norway, Austria, and most of the growth is in the new renewables, and that's mainly wind, solar, and biogas. A bit more concretely, this is capacity, so not precisely how much is generated, but you see the steep growth in wind, and in the last couple of years, pretty strong growth in solar. So that's a good story. Why did this happen? There are several driving factors. I think one is, to come back to the importance of public concerns, there's a steep rise in public concerns for climate change after 2005. That then translates into a whole range of positive policies, for instance, feed-in tariffs, but also the 2008 Climate Change Act. There's also a positive story on the technology side, on major improvements in both performance and a fall in cost, partly through China, which then leads to debates in Germany if we should use the subsidies to subsidize Chinese manufacturers, so undermines the legitimacy of those feed-in tariffs. And financially, there have been green stimulus packages since the crisis 2009, which are now running out. But also more widely, globally, there have been quite steep improvements worldwide in global financial investments from 2004 to 2011. It's now about 250 billion a year worldwide. And well, this is asset finance. This also shows we are moving from the laboratory, so that's R&D, actually to installment in the real world. So we're no longer in sort of upstream small niches in the protected spaces. We're actually moving into the real world. So that's the positive side. However, I think some of those drivers are weakening. So on the public attention side, so how concerned our citizens. This is from a opinion poll from Ipsos Mori. can really see the steep increase in public attention around 2007, and from then on a decline in public attention. That's how many people say that the climate or sort of environment and pollution are one of the three main problems Britain faces. And this is more another type of indicator. If you just count the number of times the word climate change appears in major newspapers, Guardian, Times, Independent, The Express, normalized, you see a steep increase again after 2004, but then also quite a steep decrease after 2010-11. Of course, this is a very rough proxy because you only count the number of times it's mentioned. It doesn't say anything about how climate change is being discussed. But I think it still portrays something that we probably all feel, that the attention for climate change is going down, has been going down. And I think that also then translates, policymakers pick up on these things because they do their own polls. You see reductions in feed-in tariffs across Europe, UK, Germany, Spain, Italy, of course partly through austerity pressures. There's still no success of the Kyoto Protocol internationally. So in Durban we agreed not to talk until 2015, when we maybe start talking about policy that starts in 2020. So there will be sort of a lost decade at the international level. There's still massive ongoing subsidies, of course, for fossil fuels, estimated between 500 and 1,000 billion a year. It's not quite clear because governments are very keen and sophisticated in hiding the subsidies. And the stimulus packages, which I mentioned, are winding down across the world in 2011, 2012. And also the international, and of course the flagship policy from the European Union, the emissions trading scheme, is not really working because prices are low, decreasing and fluctuating, as we all know. And recently, again, the Parliament didn't agree to front load the carbon, so it's still a policy that doesn't really work. And on the financial, the third driver, the financial investment, that has been decreasing in 2012, it was all going up, but in 2012 it's been decreasing 13% worldwide. So that also is not a very positive driver. So my intermediate conclusion about the green renewables is that there's been substantial progress in the last 10-20 years, but also maybe that the momentum may be weakening, because I think various important drivers are weakening. Then the second part of the story is looking at the regimes. So we can talk about the electricity regime, these are sort of sub-regimes within that, much more on the supply input side, gas, coal, and nuclear. And the basic story I would say is that these regimes are resilient, or as the first person said, have been adaptive. The paper mainly looks at two incumbent actors, utilities and governments. They remain attached, very strongly attached to gas, coal, and nuclear. This is the story of the fuel input to UK electricity generation. It shows coal was going down until about 2000, has then stabilized. Gas, of course, the dash for gas has been going up and then stabilized, and nuclear has been going down a little bit. The paper goes in a bit more depth. I'll just take you through 1 minute per regime. Natural gas, we had the dash for gas in the 90s, so it was really taking over. And then, of course, the prices of gas and oil have been rising from about 2004, 2005, which has been the main driver for the rise of energy security. I would say even have a more prominent criterion than climate change, rather than maybe just next to it. You see, as the utilities start to use more coal in existing power plants, you see government becoming more concerned about energy security next to affordability and climate change. And it shows that leads to a shift in government's priorities. The 2003 white paper still really embraced renewables, that's where we go. And then the 2007 white paper says, no, we also want to go for CCS for gas and coal, nuclear and renewable. So you really see a shift in priorities. And of course the whole shale gas revolution, starting in the US, but now also coming to the UK, has really changed the landscape and probably, well, there are now big plans to go for 40 gas-fired power stations and to start doing shale gas drilling and exploitation in the UK, despite the Climate Change Commission saying that this will mean the UK will never be able to meet its climate change targets. So gas is really, I think, a very strong paradigm. Nuclear power seemed to be on its way out in the 1990s after privatization because of high costs and waste problems. This was confirmed by the 2003 white paper, which said no nuclear. If we will do nuclear, we will do the fullest consultation, what they promised. Then in 2005, nuclear reappeared. Blair initially forgot to consult with everyone, so he was forced to consult. Then he did consult, but he said in advance, I'm not going to listen to the outcome, we're going to do it anyway. So the government is very highly committed. The problem, however, is that the private investors are not terribly committed, because they are still afraid of the costs and the waste and the legacy problems. So that's when the government, despite their promises saying we're never going to subsidize nuclear, has abandoned that promise and is now talking with EDF about subsidizing nuclear. But that's still only one plant, the Hinkley plant. So there's no way that they're living up to their promises about how fast nuclear was going to scale up. So even you can make much about this one plant, but they have to go from 10 or 20, and it's not really happening at the scale envisaged some years ago. Coal similarly seemed to be on its way out in the 90s because of the dash for gas, acid rain problems, climate change. But again, because of the rising prices in oil and gas, it reappeared in 2004, 2005. You see that the utilities started to use more coal. They also, that's in existing power plants. They also started applying to build new coal-fired power plants, but these were delayed because of all kinds of procedural problems. So that's the utilities. The government became more concerned, committed to coal because of problems with Russia, and again rising gas prices. So they recommitted to coal, and they could do so. Both of them could do so because of the promise of CCS, which at that time became sort of a semi-viable option. That's when they announced this big £1 billion pound subsidy for a demonstration project. Initially 8 consortia signing up, and then all of them have been pulling out. So I think at present there's no actually consortia, no commercial activity on CCS. So again, that's a major setback for the government, which had committed, well, this is what we're going to do. CCS is going to save or safeguard that we actually meet the targets that we committed to in the Climate Change Act. And the new promise now is, well, we can still start building the coal-fired power plants, just give us the permits, and then the promise is we will use and install CCS when it's capture ready. So that's a very major risk, because of course when it's not, then you are locking yourself into coal for the next 30 to 40 years. So I think, just to go back, I think the UK government is really facing big problems. I mean, they signed up to these massive goals, ambitious, the most ambitious in the world in 2008. I think they don't have a clue yet how to meet those targets, because CCS is not happening, nuclear isn't happening, and wind is going rather slow. So they are under massive problems, and that's partly why they're now trying to shift to the demand side, hoping that there's some kind of magic solution there. Something about power and politics. In the paper, I try to distinguish building on Luke's 3 phases of power, 3 levels or ways in which power is being used. One I call sort of normal, interest-based politics, and the paper's got several examples. So Blair sidelining consultation about nuclear power, politicians breaking their promises not to subsidize nuclear power. Politicians such as Osborne are already, you can see them preparing, they're trying to prepare the watering down of the Climate Change Act, so all this fuss about we don't want to damage British business and competitiveness, so they're preparing the ground, is my feeling, to abandon or to weaken the Climate Change Act in 1 or 2 years' time. But this is more in the 80s, Thatcher obstructing the acid rain negotiations. Of course, politicians claim credit for having reduced CO2 emissions, although they have nothing to do with climate change policies, but all with deindustrialization and the dash for gas. And they use promises such as CCS to legitimize decisions. And this is I just came out with a list of examples, I'm sure there are lots more, but I do feel when we talk about politics and power, we also need to look at just the really basic things. It's not, I mean, part is about discourses and all the sophisticated stuff, but it's also just the basic use of power. The second is indeed more about discourses, how you keep things, push things on the agenda and keep things off the agenda. So the paper said that there are certain transition paths that are being privileged, CCS, nuclear, wind, and they're all very much upstream technology based. And Lundvall, in the 2007 paper, made a nice distinction between two types of innovation. One he called STI, Science, Technology and Innovation, that's very much based on upstream R&D. So the idea that as long as we invest lots of R&D in these options, they will eventually come to market. And he contrasted that with another pathway, which he called doing, using and interacting, which is much more on the ground, working with actors. But that path is really being downplayed. Is doing, learning and interacting, which would be, as you said, it would be much more this whole range of urban initiatives. So cities are getting really active on the ground, doing all kinds of things, urban transport, retrofitting of houses, solar and wind. And you've got all these civil society initiatives, both the transition towns and energy community initiatives. And they get a little bit of money, they get maybe 10 million or maybe 20 million. But of course, at the same time, they spend $1 billion on subsidizing CCS, which isn't happening. So it shows you the scale of commitment and where power really lies. So these types of trends, so there are a whole range of transition pathways possible, but there's certainly a whole range which is not on the agenda or really being marginalized and get less resources, support and attention. So that's a bit more the discursive side. And then in the paper I called it this embedded power, but I read Peter's paper 1998, I think, and used the term structural power, which is maybe a better one. And I distinguish three ways in which it has been played out. One is more a sort of a macro discourse, or your view on the type of transition. And that's basically, you can go for a weak ecological modernization path, which is done with the incumbent actors and technology push, or a strong ecological modernization, which is much more participatory, open, and learning, and socio-technical, and all those things. And it's definitely the weak ecological modernization version which is being advertised by the UK government, and for that matter most governments, so it's not just the UK in this matter. Then I read this stuff by Swijnkedouw from Manchester, who talks about post-political discourse, which I thought was quite interesting, because if you look how politicians talk about this low energy transition, it's very much in a managerial sense. It's not seen as a political struggle where you make choices, or a cultural challenge where you need to bring people along. It's indeed, as Tim said, it's presented as an investment challenge. So it's very managerial, administrative, it's the experts which get emphasis rather than those other actors that are in civil society or cities who have different views about where to go. And it's full of language like there's no alternative, and of course I think the British phrase, doing the right thing. From the Netherlands, I think it's just such a, it's not an argument, it's we're doing the right thing, that's why we're doing it. It's just a descriptive term, but read the news, I mean, it's often used by politicians in the UK. I don't know how they get away with it. Because who wants to do the wrong thing? I mean, it's just not an argument. And then the last thing is, I found this quite nice paper from Bailey, who characterizes UK policy style with, I think, a German and a Danish one. And he says the UK one is very paternalistic and discretionary. So ministers feel accountable to Parliament, but not to courts and the media or third parties. So it's a very sort of legalistic way of democracy. They use lots of informal consultation, but mainly with industry and scientific experts. That's partly, I read it in one of the papers, that's partly because they've cut away all the proper expertise. Maybe it was your paper. Or, because of the cutbacks in the last 20 years, most governments, I mean, they're all procedural experts rather than substantive experts. So they don't really, in the ministries, have to maybe it's your paper. They don't have the substantive expertise anymore to think about energy, so they need to consult with other experts, which are then, of course, getting a lot of power. So that's mainly industry and science. And that means also by having outsiders, so those civil society groups or cities or other, they are sort of being excluded from this consultation. So there's a particular way of decision making which helps explain why they go for this path of experts and investment and the incumbent actors. So I think overall policymakers, UK policymakers, prefer to deal with big firms, and they know how to do that well. They've been doing that for 20 years, rather than with city civil society actors. And there's an emphasis, of course, on efficiency rather than innovation in a wide sense. this is the last slide. These are the empirical conclusions again, that I think there's substantial progress on the towards renewable electricity, but renewables are still facing an uphill struggle, so that they're going up, but the regime is still fairly resilient because of the still ongoing commitments both from industry and government. And these are the three summary of the political struggles. Well, normal politics helps still to protect the incumbent regimes. Certain transition paths, particularly the technology ones, are being privileged over the broader socio-technical paths. And I think this deeper structural power, which maybe, it's maybe a controversial conclusion, maybe makes the UK an unlikely country to lead this energy transition. There's a lot of talk about the UK leading it, but I'm afraid, just like the Netherlands, by the way, so we talked about it, but we're not leading at all now. Maybe the UK is soon. Thank you.
Thank you.